If we don't make a deal with Canada, we're going to put a big tariff on cars, could be a 50 or 100%, because we don't want their cars.
And can the U.S. auto industry survive without Canada?
Right now, the most powerful and alarming question facing North American trade is this: what happens to the United States economy if Canada stops building America's cars? For the first time in 6 decades, a president is openly threatening to tear apart one of the most deeply integrated supply chains on the planet. Donald Trump says every automobile sold inside the United States must be made inside the United States, and he is willing to use tariffs as high as 100% to force that outcome. This is not a routine policy debate. This is a direct hit aimed at a system that moves more than $125 billion in parts and vehicles across the border every single year. Today, we will break down how a single piston in a single engine crosses the border 5, 6, sometimes 7 times before a car even reaches the showroom. We will explain why the United States leans so heavily on Canadian aluminum, Canadian factories, and Canadian workers. And more importantly, we will examine why any attempt to cut Canada out of this system could trigger a new trade war, a wave of Canada boycotts, and a massive price surge for American consumers. But the real shock is what experts quietly admit will happen if this chain breaks. And that revelation is coming later in this analysis. To understand the scale of the threat facing the United States automobile industry, we need to follow the path of a single component. Consider something as small and essential as a piston. The aluminum used to create that piston is usually sourced from Quebec, a region that supplies almost 80% of all refined aluminum in North America. From there, the raw metal is transported to a plant in St. Catharines, Ontario, where it is melted and formed. It then crosses into Michigan to be machined to precise United States standards before returning again to Canada, where it is installed into an engine in Windsor. Only after that does it cross the border one more time to reach an assembly line in the United States. This journey, repeated 5 or 6 times, is not unusual. It is the design. It is how the system was built under the Auto Pact of 1965, reinforced later by NAFTA and then by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. A vehicle sold inside the United States today is often the product of hundreds of Canadian and American hands, thousands of miles of transport, and decades of integrated planning. This is why the threat of massive tariffs feels less like a policy shift and more like the opening move of a trade war. Tariffs of 50 or 100% would immediately make Canadian components unaffordable for United States manufacturers. General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis would be forced to re-engineer their entire production networks. They would need to replace Canadian aluminum with higher-cost alternatives, relocate engine manufacturing, and replicate specialized facilities that took Canada more than half a century to build. And then there is the labor crisis. The United States manufacturing sector is already short of workers with the expertise needed to operate advanced machining equipment. Canada fills part of that gap. Removing Canada from the process would expose the United States to delays, shortages, and unexpected cost spikes that would ripple across the economy. But this is only the first layer of the problem. Because once tariffs begin, Canada boycotts and retaliatory actions could escalate the situation far beyond the automobile sector. And the next part of this analysis will show why the stakes are even higher than they appear. For many households inside the United States, the automobile is not a luxury. It is a backbone of daily life, necessary for commuting to work, transporting children, or reaching medical services in the vast stretches between American towns. This means the cost of transportation is effectively the cost of survival. That is why any disruption in the United States-Canada automobile corridor is far more than a trade issue. It is a direct threat to household budgets across the entire country. Analysts from the Center for Automotive Research estimate that removing Canada from the production system would increase the average cost of a new vehicle by at least $5,000 to $8,000. When written out, that is $5,000 to $8,000 additional dollars that Americans must find in an economy where wages have not kept pace with inflation for more than a decade. The burden would fall hardest on middle-income families, seniors on fixed incomes, and young workers already priced out of the housing and credit markets. In the most car-dependent regions of the United States, such as the Midwest and the South, this shock would be felt almost immediately. The used car market, which millions of Americans rely on, would not escape pressure either. Higher prices for new vehicles almost always elevate the cost of used inventory. During the recent pandemic period, price spikes of 40% in the used vehicle market pushed many families into debt or out of transportation entirely. A similar shock triggered by tariffs could be just as damaging and far more prolonged, because this time the cause would be structural rather than temporary. On the business side, the damage would spread even faster. Most United States manufacturers operate on lean inventory models, meaning they receive parts only hours before they are needed. Any attempt to slash Canada out of the equation would instantly break that system. Aluminum costs would rise, engine components would be delayed, shipping lines crossing the border would shrink from thousands of daily crossings to a small fraction of their original flow. American factories, even those located deep inside the United States, would experience shutdowns within days. This is the overlooked reality of a modern trade war. It does not begin on a negotiation stage. It begins in the parking lots of closed factories and in the neighborhoods where workers wait for a paycheck that never arrives. Beyond the immediate financial burden on families, the broader economic chain reaction for the United States could be severe. The automobile industry supports more than 1 million American jobs directly and several million more indirectly through logistics, ports, raw materials, design, and dealership networks. The United States Chamber of Commerce has already warned that breaking the cross-border supply chain could erase more than 250,000 American jobs in the medium term. These losses would not be evenly distributed. They would concentrate in regions already fragile, including Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin. A second and equally serious concern is monetary stability. Economists at the Peterson Institute have shown that the removal of Canada from the integrated production chain could lift vehicle-related inflation across the United States economy by at least 1 full percentage point. In a nation where the Federal Reserve has spent years trying to squeeze inflation back toward target levels, a new inflation surge would complicate interest rate policy, risk stagnation, and potentially weaken the United States dollar in global markets. Meanwhile, Canada boycotts and retaliatory tariffs would further strain bilateral trade. During the steel and aluminum dispute in 2018, Canada responded with dollar-for-dollar countermeasures. If the United States imposes tariffs of 50 to 100% on Canadian automobiles, a symmetrical retaliation on United States vehicles entering Canada becomes almost certain. This would threaten the United States export market of approximately 1.8 million vehicles sold to Canada each year. The collateral damage would spread outward from trade flows to national reputation. International partners would interpret a United States-Canada trade war as a signal that long-standing alliances can be destabilized by sudden political shifts. That opens the door for competitors such as China to increase influence in the Canadian manufacturing sector, potentially redirecting investment, supply chains, and even strategic partnerships. And yet, the most serious long-term consequences are not the ones most people expect. There is a deeper, more structural vulnerability hidden inside the United States automobile system, one that very few analysts discuss publicly, and that revealing detail comes next. Inside Washington, the debate has become far more complicated than public speeches suggest. The idea of bringing every automobile job back to the United States sounds powerful in a political rally. It appeals to workers who watched factories close, towns decline, and entire regions lose their economic identity over the past 3 decades. But inside the policy rooms of the Capitol, analysts view the proposal very differently. They see a system tied together by decades of integration, legal agreements, and essential cost efficiencies that cannot simply be replaced by political will. The United States government is already confronting a shortage of skilled manufacturing labor. According to the National Association of Manufacturers, the United States is on track to face more than 2 million unfilled manufacturing positions by the year 2030. Rebuilding the entire automobile supply chain within American borders would require a labor force that simply does not exist. Even if wages rise sharply, the pool of qualified machinists, toolmakers, welders, and robotic technicians is too small to replace the Canadian expertise embedded in the system. Then there is the financial cost. Constructing 5 or 6 new assembly plants would require at least $15 to $20 billion in investment, and that assumes no delays, no cost overruns, and stable supply lines for machinery. Washington understands that these investments cannot be forced onto manufacturers without severe strain. If companies refuse, the United States would be left with a fractured system, higher prices, lower production, and more dependence on imported vehicles from regions outside North America. Finally, the political risk is substantial. If tariffs of 50 to 100% push automobile prices higher, voters will feel the pain quickly. That means the political reward of punishing foreign competitors could collapse under the weight of real household costs. And if Canada responds with Canada boycotts and retaliatory tariffs, the United States could face a backlash from its most stable and loyal trading partner. This is why many officials in Washington quietly acknowledge that escalating the trade war may carry more long-term damage than immediate benefits. Outside North America, the world is watching closely. The automobile supply chain that links Canada and the United States is one of the most integrated bilateral manufacturing systems in modern history. When such a system comes under pressure, the ripple effects are not confined to two nations. They spread globally, influencing commodity markets, investment flows, and the strategic calculations of American competitors. European Union officials have already expressed concern that a United States-Canada trade war could destabilize global automobile prices. Europe has spent decades building its own supply chains, and any sudden tariff escalation in North America could shift investment toward European factories. But the European Union also fears being caught in a broader protectionist cycle that drags in steel, electronics, and energy. If tariffs escalate uncontrolled, the rules of open markets central to European prosperity could weaken further. China sees the situation through a different lens. For Beijing, any fracture between the United States and Canada is an opportunity. Chinese manufacturers, especially those producing electric vehicles, have been expanding aggressively worldwide. If Canada faces pressure from United States tariffs, it may open the door wider to Chinese companies seeking partners, subsidies, or new export routes. Increased Chinese access to Canadian markets could reduce United States influence over North American industrial policy and shift strategic power toward Asia. Mexico is another key player. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, Mexico already benefits from competitive labor costs and rising investment in electric vehicle supply chains. If Canada is weakened by tariffs or trade war pressure, automakers could relocate production south, not north. That would undermine the very objective the United States is trying to achieve, reshoring jobs. Instead, Mexico would become the largest beneficiary of the turmoil. This is why international economists warn that a trade war between the United States and Canada could become a destabilizing global event. It threatens not only the price of vehicles, but also the strategic balance among world powers. And yet, there is still one deeper vulnerability at the core of this system, one that few Americans understand, but that could change the entire trajectory of this conflict. And that hidden weakness will be exposed in the next part. When analysts step back from the political noise, a more complex pattern begins to appear. The push to relocate all automobile production inside the United States is not only about jobs, wages, or even tariffs. It is part of a larger strategic recalibration that began more than a decade ago, as the United States attempted to rebuild domestic manufacturing strength in the face of rising global competition. In that context, the automobile industry becomes a symbol of national capability. It is both a source of pride and a measure of strategic resilience. However, symbols do not build cars. Supply chains do. And at the center of this system lies an uncomfortable truth. The United States has allowed key industrial capacities to shift outside its borders over many decades, particularly to Canada and Mexico. Canada's role in refining aluminum, producing sophisticated engine components, and operating highly specialized tooling shops is not incidental, it is foundational. Removing Canada from this equation means the United States must restore capacities that took Canada more than 50 years to master. The risk emerges when timelines collide with political promises. Building new assembly plants takes years. Training a new generation of skilled manufacturing workers takes even longer. Meanwhile, political cycles move on a 2 or 4 year schedule, there is no practical way for the United States to replicate Canada's infrastructure in time to match political expectations. If leaders push ahead without acknowledging this gap, the nation may face stalled projects, abandoned investments, and a cascade of unintended economic consequences. Another long-term concern involves the electric vehicle transition. The global automotive landscape is shifting, and countries that dominate battery manufacturing, critical mineral supply, and energy infrastructure will lead the next century of mobility. Canada holds a strategic position in this emerging system. It has vast reserves of nickel, cobalt, and other minerals essential for electric vehicle batteries. Cutting Canada out of the supply chain would leave the United States more dependent on foreign sources, including regions that are politically volatile or strategically competitive. In other words, the attempt to strengthen the United States industrial base could paradoxically make the nation more fragile. This is why many economists believe the greatest long-term danger is not a trade war itself, but the possibility that the United States undermines its own strategic foundations in the pursuit of rapid political victories. And yet, this is only one side of the long-term picture. Even in the midst of these risks, there are potential opportunities. If the United States invests heavily in advanced manufacturing, automation, robotics, and specialized training programs, it could rebuild domestic capacity in a way that strengthens national competitiveness for generations. By localizing production of engines, battery systems, and critical components, the United States could reduce long-term dependence not only on Canada, but also on nations that present strategic vulnerabilities. This is the optimistic scenario, built on the idea that disruption today leads to resilience tomorrow. However, the path to that outcome is filled with dangerous unknowns. A full-scale trade war with Canada would trigger more than tariffs. It could disrupt the pricing of aluminum, steel, and critical minerals across global markets. It could redirect Canadian investment toward Europe or Asia, particularly China, which has aggressively expanded electric vehicle production capacity. Canadian officials have already signaled that if pressured, they will diversify their partnerships. A closer relationship between Canada and China in the transportation sector would significantly weaken United States leverage in North America. Another unpredictable factor is corporate behavior. If automobile manufacturers believe the United States is entering a prolonged era of protectionism, they may shift investment to more stable markets. Mexico, with its lower labor costs and trade advantages under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, could attract the very jobs the United States is attempting to bring home. Europe, facing its own overcapacity issues, may offer incentives that draw away electric vehicle investments. Even domestic companies could resist relocating operations if costs become unsustainable. And then there is the consumer impact. Higher costs, fewer choices, and longer waiting times could spark public frustration. If Canada boycotts emerge in response to United States tariffs, the political fallout could expand beyond economics into cultural and diplomatic tensions unseen in the modern era of North American cooperation. All of these risks converge into a single, unavoidable conclusion. A trade war does not simply test supply chains. It tests alliances, political stability, economic patience, and the balance of power in a region that has been unified for more than half a century. But the deepest question has not yet been answered. What happens if the integrated system that built North America's automobile dominance truly collapses? The answer, according to several experts, is more alarming than the public realizes, and that insight comes next. As the debate intensifies, a quiet but startling consensus has emerged among senior strategists inside the United States manufacturing and national security community. They warn that the real threat is not the immediate shock of tariffs, factory shutdowns, or temporary price spikes. Those are painful but predictable. The deeper threat is the possibility that dismantling the integrated North American supply chain will push the United States into a long-term industrial isolation that the nation is not prepared to survive. Behind closed doors, several economists and industry analysts have outlined a troubling scenario. If the United States attempts to rebuild its entire automobile ecosystem internally, the transition period could last 10 to 20 years. During that time, the United States would face unpredictable shortages of aluminum, critical minerals, tooling equipment, and specialized machining capacity. These shortages could disrupt not only automobiles, but also aerospace, defense, heavy manufacturing, and even the renewable energy sector. In other words, the automobile conflict could bleed into every major pillar of United States industry. Meanwhile, Canada would be forced to redirect its production toward new global partners. The European Union has expressed interest in securing Canadian aluminum, battery minerals, and electric vehicle partnerships. China has already expanded diplomatic and commercial outreach to Canada for more than a decade. If Canada shifts its industrial alignment toward Europe or China, the United States would not only lose a manufacturing partner, it would lose strategic influence across the entire northern half of the continent. This is why analysts quietly admit that a prolonged trade war could become a structural turning point. It could weaken the North American industrial platform that has anchored United States economic strength since the end of the Second World War. And once that foundation erodes, rebuilding it becomes exponentially more difficult. There is, however, another layer to this story, one that connects political leverage, corporate pressure, and the strategic reshuffling of North American investment. Some experts argue that the ultimate goal of the tariff threat is not to expel Canada from the supply chain. Instead, it may be designed to intimidate manufacturers into redirecting future investment toward the United States without actually dismantling the existing system. Under this theory, the threat of 50 to 100% tariffs functions as a negotiating tool rather than a policy destination. Automakers are forced to reconsider where they place new factories, battery facilities, and research centers. Canada, facing the possibility of Canada boycotts or tariff retaliation, would become more cautious in pursuing partnerships with Europe or China. Mexico would need to tread carefully to avoid becoming the next target. If this interpretation is correct, the conflict may not be about eliminating Canada from the system, but about reshaping the investment landscape to ensure the United States receives a larger share of the next generation of manufacturing, especially electric vehicle batteries, critical mineral refining, and advanced robotics. But this strategy carries a dangerous gamble. If Canada or automakers misread the threat, the situation could escalate beyond the point of control. A single retaliatory move, such as Canadian tariffs on United States vehicles, or a sudden shift toward Chinese electric vehicle technology, could transform a political tactic into a full-scale trade war. This is the scenario industry insiders fear most. Because once the conflict crosses that line, the economic damage becomes irreversible. And the final question, the one almost no one wants to ask, goes far deeper than tariffs or supply chains. It cuts to the future of North American power itself. And that final question is what we will confront in the conclusion. A question that could redefine the trajectory of the United States economy for an entire generation. After examining the full weight of this issue, one reality becomes unmistakably clear. The automobile partnership between the United States and Canada is not just a trade arrangement. It is the structural backbone of North American industry, the quiet engine that has powered jobs, affordability, and continental stability for more than half a century. Any attempt to fracture this system through aggressive tariffs, retaliatory actions, or Canada boycotts risks triggering a trade war that neither nation is prepared to manage. If the United States chooses to rebuild every component, every factory, and every supply link within its own borders, the cost will be measured not only in dollars, but in inflation, job displacement, strategic vulnerability, and lost geopolitical influence. If Canada redirects its industrial partnerships toward Europe or China, the balance of power inside North America could shift in ways that were unthinkable just a decade ago. This leaves us with a single defining question. Is this bold reshoring strategy a necessary step toward long-term independence, or is it a costly miscalculation that could weaken the United States for an entire generation? If you found this analysis valuable, make sure to subscribe for more fact-based coverage of global trade, economic shifts, and geopolitical strategy.